Hi there, I'm Lou.
And I'm Lee.
And this is Uncovering History. Hi there, and welcome to our third episode of Uncovering History. Now, today we're going to be looking at the history of witches. And again, Lee has done some incredible research on this topic. So, Lee, where are we going to start?
Hello, yes, and welcome to everyone. So, as Lucy has stated, we will be covering the history of witchcraft and the Salem Witch Trials today. This is more of a widely known subject when compared to the last episode that we covered, which was Jack the Ripper. But as always, I wanted to put out a disclaimer stating that this episode is in no way attempting to glorify the murders or the events that took place. So, I wanted to start with the origin of witches. So historically, witches have always been seen as doing the devil's work. However, many practice witchcraft or different forms of medicine to cast magic spells, calling upon spirits to help cure the ill or to solve existing problems. One of the earliest records for witches is actually in the Bible, with this particular area being thought to have been written somewhere around 800 BC. It tells the story of when King Saul required the witch of Endor to summon the dead prophet Samuel's spirit to help him defeat the Philistine army. The witch, as requested, forced Samuel to rise, and as such he prophesied the death of Saul and his sons. Tragically, the next day, according to the Bible, Saul's sons died in battle and Saul himself commits suicide. It's quite an eerie story that most certainly backfired on all involved.
That's an interesting one, actually, because, during RE lessons, which is religious education in the UK, I can't remember any sort of story that was told about witches in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it's probably something that's just been glazed over and it's not really a topic that was ever really discussed.
No.
So now we'll move on to the growth of witchcraft. So the term Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to the hammer of witches, is what is thought to have been one of the sole drivers of the barbaric events that took place over the course of a few centuries in Europe. The book was written by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. The book was essentially a detailed guide on how to identify, hunt, catch, and interrogate witches. Witches were often subjected to a plethora of torture routines, which would usually end with the lady or gentleman being hung or burned alive at the stake. Unfortunately, due to their isolated nature, single women, widows, and other women on the outsides of society were often targeted heavily.
Bit harsh.
Absolutely so. Between the years of 1500 to 1600 AD, it is believed that around 80,000 witches, and I use that term lightly, were put to death in Europe, most of which were believed to be working with the devil and filled with lust. In terms of countries, Germany had the highest execution rate, while Ireland had the lowest. The authors at the time quickly became the authority for Protestants and Catholics trying to flush out any witches living and residing among their communities. It is also said that for over 100 years, the book sold more copies than every other book published during that time frame, except for the Bible.
Wow, so I guess people were really worried about witches back then.
It was a problem that was growing in their eyes, yeah.
Okay.
So, before we move on to the Salem Witch Trials, I just want to cover the first US witch that was officially trialed. So, on June the 19th, 1656, in Boston, Massachusetts, Anne Hibbins was charged, convicted, and executed for witchcraft. She was the third unfortunate victim of witchcraft trials, but the first one to be trialed officially. This brought upon the beginning of the events that would later unfold in Salem as the fear of witches grew exponentially. So now that we have briefly discussed the origins of witches, the growth of witches, and the rampant evil of the ones hunting witches through Europe and other parts of America, we will now move on to the main topic for this episode, which is the Salem Witch Trials. So, the Salem Witch Trials took place between 1692 and 1693 in Salem Village, Massachusetts. In total, 22 women and men lost their lives through execution and torture. 19 were hanged at Proctor's Ledge near Gallows Hill, 2 died in prison, and 1 man was horrifically tortured to death. In total, there is said to be around 200 people identified as potential suspects.
200?
Absolutely. You'll see as we go on through, they get to the point where they are arresting and interrogating everyone.
Wow, okay.
So as such, I will now attempt to build a clear timeline of the events that unfolded for clarity. So, in January 1692, the daughter and niece of Samuel Parris, who was the minister of Salem Village, 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams began having regular fits, including violent contortions and uncontrollable outbursts of screaming. Now, if we fast forward on to mid-February 1692, a local doctor known as Dr. Griggs is called to the afflicted girls, where he suggests that witchcraft may be the cause for such events and their strange behaviour. Now, moving on to February the 25th with the witch cake. Tituba, who was the servant of the household, at the request of a neighbour, Mary Sibley, baked a witch's cake and fed it to a dog. According to historical English folk remedies, feeding a dog a cake of this kind, which contained urine of the afflicted, would counteract any harmful spells put on the 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams.
Hang on a minute. So someone is feeding a dog a cake full of urine?
Effectively, yes.
Well, that's all kinds of wrong.
And it's an English folk remedy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, the reason the cake is being fed to the dog is due to the dog being believed to be a familiar of the devil, which once again ties into history and alongside the goat. It is at this point, pressured by the ministry, that 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams accused Tituba as being a witch. Alongside this, they also accused homeless beggar Sarah Good and the poor elderly Sarah Osborne as being the ones who placed the spells on them.
I don't really like this whole part of history where women who were homeless or were not married or were just, basically slightly different than everyone else were just coupled into this kind of umbrella term of being a witch.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And like we said before, the ones that are sort of isolated are the easiest to convict effectively. So
yeah,
it unfortunately is a path that they sort of went down.
Is it typically a lot of people that were poor?
Within here, there are some people who came from impoverished backgrounds, but there are also some who were regarded highly in the community that were also bundled into the witch category.
Oh, interesting. I just assumed that it was just poor people.
No, not all the time, no. So we'll continue on with the examinations. So in late February, on the 29th, arrest warrants are issued for Tituba, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. On March the 1st, magistrates John Hathborne and Jonathan Corwin examined Tituba, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne for witches' teats. Now, this was deemed to have a wart-like appearance or a bump on the skin, similar to what we see in cinematography today. Tituba immediately confessed to practicing witchcraft and confirmed that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had in fact been her co-conspirators. This was likely done in an attempt to hopefully save herself or receive a lesser punishment.
Is that where they got this kind of stereotype of a witch then? Warty nose and all of that?
Yeah, sort of like big protruding bumps, yeah, and just sort of like looking...
Bit ugly.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, the term would be ugly. So the accusations continue from here. So as we move into early March, 5 new young girls begin to show the same symptoms of uncontrollable screaming and contortions. These were Anne Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Mary Warren, and Elizabeth Hubbard.
Would there be just a possibility that these kids or, young women were just maybe plagued with, epilepsy or something medically wrong with them rather than just, coming to the conclusion they must be witches?
Not according to Salem.
Oh, okay.
So it is at this point that the accusations continue, as I've said above. During the month of March, Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, whom were both regarded as respected, upstanding members of the community and the church, were accused. Alongside this, Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas Good, was also accused of witchcraft and was subsequently arrested by Marshal Deputy Samuel Brabock.
Whoa. 4 years old.
A 4-year-old witch was arrested, according to them, yeah.
And what was her name? Dorcas.
Her name was Dorcas Good.
That's unfortunate, really, isn't it? But also 4 years old.
So Dorcas was actually quite a common name back then. There's someone else that features in this also called Dorcas.
Oh, wow. Well, I don't know anyone called Dorcas anymore.
No, it's one of those names that has died out.
But 4 years old, that's just shocking.
Well, it's because she had a connection to her mother. So immediately she was the offspring of a witch, so she must be a witch.
Therefore, hereditary. Yeah, okay.
Collect the witches together, yeah. Yeah, so the interrogations intensify from here. So during late March, Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse and Dorcas Good, remember the 4-year-old, were all interrogated to spill the secrets of their part in the tale of witchcraft that was unfolding, albeit forcibly. This is once again done by magistrates Hathorne and Corwin. And at this point, I also want to make note that the main accusations thus far have come from the new group of 5 girls that we mentioned earlier, which consists of Anne Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, etc. So it's at this point that we'll have a quick segue to discuss what we know so far, while also going over the names, as I can appreciate there are a lot, and hopefully it'll get easier over time to follow. So we have the original children experiencing the bouts of uncontrollable screaming. These are 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams. We also have the 5 new girls whom have accused many people thus far. These are Anne Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Mary Warren, and Elizabeth Hubbard. We also have the 2 magistrates who are convinced that everyone is guilty, which are John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. We also have the 3 accused and arrested, which is Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. And finally, we have the 3 recently interrogated suspects, Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas Good.
All women.
For now.
Poor women.
For now. Right. So as you can see, there's a lot going on. So let's continue on and let's continue to try and build this picture. So it is at this point that another community member, Elizabeth Proctor, is accused of witchcraft on March the 28th. Alongside this, on April the 3rd, Sarah Cloyce, after defending her sister, Rebecca Nurse, is also accused of witchcraft.
So it seems that basically, if someone's accused of witchcraft in a family, then automatically, if anyone tries to defend that person, they're also accused.
They're also guilty, yeah, and once again associated with the initial suspect. So what I was going to say, which is basically what you've covered, is that at this point, anyone that speaks out or does not conform is accused, which definitely is the case here. So on April the 11th, Elizabeth's husband, John Proctor, who protested the examination of his wife, became the first man to be accused and incarcerated for witchcraft. So as we've seen here, once again, the picture continues to build. The husband has now tried to defend his wife, and immediately he's also now a witch.
But I mean, what could you do, to be honest? You know, if your husband or wife is accused of being something, you know, of that sort of nature, and you kind of can see where this is going to end up going, you know, if anyone loved anyone else, they would have to, you know, defend that person.
You would naturally do it, yeah.
Yeah, of course. But then all of a sudden, you're also a witch. It's ridiculous.
It's a lose-lose situation at the minute, unfortunately, but it's at this point where the story really turns into something quite peculiar. So, in early April, Mary Warren, one of the 5 young girls accusing people, admits to lying and accuses the other girls of lying too. Now, at the same time, Anne Putnam Jr., who's also part of the 5, accuses a new man called Giles Corey of witchcraft and alleges that a man who died at Corey's house also haunts her, which once again is completely unrelated and irrelevant to the story in question, but once again sort of shows the naivety of the girls and maybe not understanding what they're actually doing.
You've got to be honest, though, that these kids, they're kids, you know?
Yeah.
And obviously they're terrified, probably, about what's going to happen to them, what situation they're in. And I think, you know, someone of that age would say anything.
Yeah, no, definitely. So on April the 19th, Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, who are both new suspects, Giles Corey, and Mary Warren, who is one of the 5 who recently admitted to lying, were all examined by the magistrates. As a result, Mary Warren immediately reversed her statement made in early April and subsequently rejoined the accusers once more. So she's gone back to her group of 5.
Okay.
Right, so we're starting to build a picture here now that the 5 young girls see this as more of a form of game without understanding the ramifications of their actions. So to them, they have the sort of mindset at the minute that they're capable of creating these stories, recanting the stories, going back to the stories without realizing that people's lives are literally at stake here.
And I guess that's why nowadays in courts and things like that, you can't really be a witness or have any sort of say in any sort of trials if you're under a certain age without, unless something's happened to you and you're that age, you can't, you're unreliable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the right decision as well. So as we continue on, there are now, as you can imagine, more examinations, more accusations.
More warts?
Warts are everywhere. So it is at this point where many new names will come into contention. These are Mary Easty, another of Rebecca Nurse's sisters who defended her. And I apologise if I pronounce this wrong. Nehemiah Abbott, William and Deliverance Hobbs, Edward and Sarah Bishop, Mary Black, Sarah Wilds, Sarah Churchill, and Mary English. So you can see now they really are starting to ramp up who they're questioning and who they're considering to be a witch.
There's a lot of Marys in this list.
Very common name. Very common name, yeah. So several girls, including the 5 young once again, also accuse former Salem minister George Burroughs of witchcraft. Now, bear in mind that George Burroughs at this time doesn't even live in Salem anymore. He's moved to Maine. However, based on these accusations, he is arrested in Maine and returned to Salem, where he is immediately placed in jail.
Oh dear.
So we can once again see that they're now targeting families that either do not agree with what is going on or have any known connection to anyone accused. It really was a shocking state of affairs.
I guess it's just, if you're connected in any sort of way, you're kind of damned, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of these events, accusations and arrests take place between April 22nd, 1692 and May the 7th, 1692. So continuing on and moving into May, on May the 9th, George Burroughs is moved to a Boston jail from Salem. On May the 10th, we have our first unfortunate and undeserved death. On this day, Sarah Osborne, one of the original 3 accused, alongside Tituba and Sarah Good, passed away in prison. Alongside this tragic event, George Jacobs Sr. and his granddaughter Margaret Jacobs are also examined as suspects.
Do we know why they passed away in prison, or was it just one of those, we'll document it, but we won't tell you the specifics?
So I touch on it a little bit later on, but in general, back then, the conditions of prison life was terrible.
I guess.
It was common that prisoners were barely fed, were barely given water. The sleeping and living arrangements were just
diabolical.
Yeah, absolutely diabolical. So not only were you facing the difficulty of being in prison, but you were also facing the difficulty of a lack of hygiene and a lack of anything that a normal human being deserves, especially someone who's been falsely accused.
It sounds horrendous.
It really is. So we continue on now. So on May the 14th, 1692, Increase Mather and Sir William Phipps, the newly elected governor of the colony, arrive in Boston. They bring with them a charter ending the 1684 prohibition of self-governance within the colony. On May the 27th, Sir William Phipps issues a new commission for the Court of Oyer and Termina and appoints as a judge John Hathorne and 6 others. Now, John Hathorne we already know from being one of the 2 magistrates expediting the process of suspected witchcraft. Now, I included those 2 dates in for clarity, but moving back slightly to May the 18th, Mary Easty, who was recently examined, is released from prison. However, due to protests by her accusers, she is subsequently arrested again. And on this day, Roger Toothaker is also arrested on charges of witchcraft. So, I also want to make a point clear that everyone that has been examined was also put in jail afterwards, and I apologise if that wasn't clear until now. On May the 31st, Hathorne and 2 other members of the commission examined Martha Carrier, John Alden, Wilmot Redd, Elizabeth Hoe, and Philip English. English and Alden were able to escape from prison and did not return to Salem until after the trials had ended. Once again, that burning desire to try everyone appears. And now, unfortunately, we move on to our second victim. On June the 2nd, 1692, we unfortunately learn the fate of our second victim, Bridget Bishop. She was the first to be tried and convicted of witchcraft, and subsequently was sentenced to death by hanging. Her hanging was set for the 10th of June. And on the 8th of June, 18-year-old Elizabeth Booth begins to show symptoms of affliction by witchcraft. Now, we'll move on to developments to the court. So on June the 15th, Cotton Mather writes a letter requesting the court not use spectral evidence, now this is evidence based on dreams and visions, as a standard, while urging that the trials be sped up. The Court of Oyer ignores the request around spectral evidence but agrees to speed up the trials.
So they didn't want to use any sort of evidence about any sort of dreams?
Effectively, yeah. People started to argue that it wasn't a definitive way of determining whether or not someone was guilty or innocent.
Okay. Fair enough. And I guess to try and speed up the process as well, trying to eliminate any sort of waffle.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, I'm not too sure. There wasn't that much information on that part, so
okay.
That is limited, unfortunately. So on June the 16th, we have our second unfortunate casualty through prison, and Roger Toothaker unfortunately passes. Now, I also want to quickly note, going back to what we said earlier, that the conditions inside the prisons would have been absolutely disgusting. The idea of hygiene would not exist, and the food and water available was not plentiful. And as such, there was a plethora of ways that one could become ill through prolonged stays.
I guess with, how horrendous the sort of conditions would be. I mean, in today's standards, the prisons are pretty much luxurious places, aren't they, compared to what they used to be?
Whereas back then, there would have been rampant disease also that would spread through prisons regularly.
Okay.
So, on June the 29th to June the 30th, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, Sarah Good, and Elizabeth Hoe are tried, pronounced guilty, and sentenced to hang. This would bring the total casualties up to 8. 2 from which sadly died in prison, while the other 6 had been sentenced to hang. On July the 19th, these hangings took place on Gallows Hill for all to see.
So Gallows Hill is quite a famous place, isn't it?
It is indeed, yeah. It's pretty much one of the centerpieces for the Salem Hill trials.
Scary.
So, now we move on a few weeks to August the 5th, 1692. George Jacobs Jr., Martha Carrier, George Burroughs, who remember was moved to a different Boston prison, John Willard, John Proctor, and Elizabeth Proctor are pronounced guilty and sentenced to hang. This also included a testimony from George Jacobs' senior granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs, that resulted in George Jacobs Sr. and George Burroughs being deemed guilty. Now, if you remember back as well, Margaret Jacobs was examined. So once again, this seems another way of her trying to potentially relieve her punishment. This was another incredibly sad day in Salem, as the Court of Oyer had shown their desires to speed up the process significantly, and in their eyes, everyone was guilty.
Did how did the kind of other people within the community feel about these trials? Do you know?
So once again, it's difficult to find information that can be sort of relied on. But in general, it seemed that a lot of people spoke up and they all end up being examined and incarcerated. I guess that's why we got to a total above 200.
Yeah.
Because although I don't mean that disrespectfully, only 22 passed away as a result, over 200 were arrested and examined.
Yeah.
So it just shows that a large part of the town did try and do something.
I guess they were probably just filled with fear and anxiety that if they did say anything, they would end up in that position.
Exactly, yeah. So these would become the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th and 14th victims of the Salem Witch Trials. On August the 19th, George Jacobs Sr., Martha Carrier, George Burroughs, John Willard and John Proctor were hanged on Gallows Hill. Elizabeth Proctor was not hanged because she was pregnant at the time.
Oh, so they had a moral conscience at that point, did they?
There seems to be a very warped conscience, yeah. So as a result, only 13 victims existed as of that date.
Okay.
However, a sad event occurred on August the 20th when Margaret Jacobs recanted her testimony.
What happened?
So basically, from what I could find online, it was through guilt.
Okay.
That her testimony had led to 2 innocent men being hanged, one of which being a direct family member.
It's funny, really, that, well, in a facetious way, that, I guess in history and, when we're taught about kind of the trials of witches, it always seems to be about the women. So actually hearing that there were some men, it's quite interesting, really, that they were also kind of brought into this sort of, horrific ordeal as well.
Yeah, there was no discrimination of gender. Everyone was...
And age as well.
Yeah, everyone was capable of being a witch, regardless of their background, beliefs, or day-to-day lifestyle. So, as we continue on this sad journey, we move to September 9th, 1692. And on this day, Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Anne Pudeator, Dorcas Hoare, and Mary Bradbury are pronounced guilty and sentenced to hang. Unfortunately, due to the timeline and the dates of which these tragic events occurred, not much is known about the examinations and events leading up to the guilty verdict being given, and as such, that's why we hear some of these names for the first time. So we now move on to mid-September in 1692, where Giles Corey is indicted. And on the 17th of September, 1692, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Redd, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Abigail Faulkner, Rebecca Earns, Mary Lacey, Anne Foster, and Abigail Hobbs are tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. As we've seen with the previous convictions, more and more people are being tried and convicted each week. This showed how out of control and barbaric the court proceedings had become. No one had a fair chance.
So there's just tons and tons of people now being accused and killed.
Yeah, so it's essentially at the minute, many people are being arrested, but I apologise if it's difficult to follow. There are just so many names of important people that were unfortunately tried and sentenced to hang or imprisoned for the wrong reasons. So I wanted to highlight this throughout.
Well, it just shows just the magnitude of how many people were involved in these trials, which is just shocking, really, isn't it?
It is. It really is. It's a terrible time in history. And now we move on to September 19th, where sheriffs administer peine forte deux, which is a French historical torture method, which is essentially the action of pressing through increasing weighted stones on their chest. So over time, the weight of the stones on the chest would get heavier and as such would cause more stress, cause more pain, and put the recipient under duress. Now, this was performed to Giles Corey after he refused to enter a plea of charges of witchcraft against him, and after 2 days of torture, unfortunately, Giles Corey passed away.
So they were just putting stones on their chests?
It's an old form of torture, yes. So what they do is they bound your hands and legs so that you can't move, and then they just apply weight over a period of time, so it becomes harder and harder to breathe.
That'd be awful.
It's designed, to basically get what you want from the person.
What, so they talk?
Yeah, it's a form of torture. They wanted him to plea and admit that he was a witch. God. And that was how they were going to get it out of him.
That just sounds really horrific.
Yeah, I mean, and it's...
barbaric, even.
There's other sort of historical torture methods that we'll cover when we go through sort of the medieval period and other sections of British history. But yeah, this is a famous one from France.
Well, thank God that doesn't happen today. Well, in our country, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's horrible. It really is. And this makes Giles Corey the 14th victim of the Salem Witch Trials so far. So if we continue on September 22nd, Martha Corey, Margaret Scott, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Anne Pudeator, Wilmot Redd, Samuel Wardwell, and Mary Parker are hanged on Gallows Hill. Dorcas Hoare was not hanged on that day due to confessing.
And is this a different Dorcas now?
Yes, so this isn't the 4-year-old that we mentioned at the beginning. This is the lady that we spoke about recently that was arrested. So this unfortunately makes the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st and 22nd victims of the Salem Witch Trials.
Horrendous. That's too many. One is too many.
Absolutely. There really is. The numbers began to really tally up and none of it was justified. That's the saddest part of this. Right. So continuing on October the 3rd, 1692, we finally see the first glimpse of sanity from the village of Salem as the Reverend Increase Mather, that we mentioned earlier, who was also the president of Harvard College and father to Cotton Mather, who was the lady who sent the letter asking for spectral evidence to no longer be accepted, denounces the use of spectral evidence.
And spectral evidence was the dreams, wasn't it?
Dreams and visions, yeah.
Dreams and visions, okay.
Yeah. So, on October the 8th, 1692, Governor Phipps orders that spectral evidence is no longer to be admitted in witchcraft trials.
Okay.
So that's a really big step forward because now no longer people can have a vision or a dream and then suddenly believe that someone's a witch to the point where they end up losing their life.
I guess it's not concrete evidence, and I guess that's kind of like the development of these sort of court-like systems back in these, medieval times.
Yeah, and we also know to this day now that dreams can be manipulated and adjusted based on what we've watched before we've gone to bed, what we've eaten before we've gone to bed. So as such, it's not a fair way of...
Like cheese.
Yeah, it gives you nightmares.
I didn't believe this for a long time, but actually I had quite a bit of cheese, maybe, I don't know, a month ago. And I had the most vivid dreams. I honestly thought they were real. And when you wake up and you're just like, oh my God. And then it takes you a while to really think about, no, that was a dream. Get over yourself.
I mean, or when we watch a horror TV show or a film before bed and then you get a little bit scared.
All right, let's not go into that.
So as the weeks go on, we begin to see more sanity within the town. And on October 29th, Sir William Phipps prohibits any further arrests while releasing many accused witches. He also went on to dissolve the Court of Oyer and Termina, which were the ones that were causing all of the trouble, holding all of the court hearings, and ultimately sentencing people to death. However, in an attempt to fight back, the General Court establishes a superior court to try the remaining witches on November the 25th. It is at this point that we can see the power of the crazed hunters beginning to burn out. And on January the 3rd, 1693, Judge Staunton, who was a part of the Court of Oyer and Termina, orders execution of all suspected witches who were exempted by their pregnancy. However, Phipps denied enforcement of the order while forcing Staunton to leave the bench. Once again, this was removing power from the ones that did not deserve.
So we've got someone basically saying that those women who were pregnant and therefore were not put to death, they should now be put to death.
They should still be put to death, yeah.
But we have this other guy, what was his name?
Sir William Phipps.
He's saying, go away.
He's the governor, yeah. So I think at this point he's finally realising that when the party was put together and the Court of Oyer and Termina was created, that it was a mistake and it's got way out of control.
Mm-mm.
So this is him finally trying to rectify a very bad situation.
I guess it's where that metaphor comes from, this is a witch hunt.
Yeah.
Just ridiculous, hysterical sort of grappling at any sort of evidence. So
contrived, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so during January 1693, 49 of the 52 surviving people brought into court on witchcraft charges are released because their arrests were based on spectral evidence.
Oh, okay.
So once again, that's a small win for a very sort of, a town that's seen such destruction
over
the sort of last 5-6 months. And now someone that we've not really seen since the beginning, who was one of the original three, Tituba, was released from prison in 1693. The date itself is hazy. I've seen many different dates, so I've chosen to not choose one just for clarity. But unfortunately, after being released, she was immediately sold to a new master, which was a terribly sad and unfathomable situation, which just outlined the amount of pain and suffering that this poor girl went through over the last 6 months.
So she was kind of cleared of being a witch, and then she was sold on to someone else where she probably had an even worse life.
Yeah, it's really tragic how the events unfolded. And now moving on, we fast forward a few months to May 1693, where we see further promising news as Sir William Phipps once again pardons those still in prison on witchcraft charges. And as I've said before, my only comment would be that I wish he had have done it sooner.
I guess, but at least that happened, because it could have been a lot worse if no one had been kind of looking at this with, logic. Then, the numbers could be ridiculously high.
Where would it have stopped? Yeah,
exactly.
And so this was a horrific series of events driven by false confessions, false accusations, and a group of people whom did not deserve the power that they wielded. This unfortunate event will go down in history as one of the most tragic, especially in the US. And I wanted to end the podcast by going over some of the areas of the timeline further down the line. So we fast forward almost 4 years here to January the 14th, where the General Court orders a day of fasting and soul searching for the tragedy at Salem. And also in 1697, once again, Minister Samuel Parris is ousted as minister in Salem and replaced by Joseph Green. Now, Samuel Parris, if you remember, is the father of the daughter that was one of the original three.
Yeah.
Who first started seeing and experiencing contortions and bouts of uncontrollable screaming. And now once again, moving on almost 5 years, in 1702, the General Court declares the 1692 trials unlawful. And in 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., who was part of the 5 young girls who were effectively accusing everyone, publicly apologised for her actions in 1692.
So the maths, I'm terrible at maths.
So 14 years on.
14 years on, she finally apologises.
And they were young, heading towards their early teenage years. So she's probably working her way towards 30 at this point. So
crikey.
Her moral compass has finally sort of aligned true north again.
Mm.
And in 1711, the colony passed a legislative bill restoring the rights and good names of those accused of witchcraft while granting £600 in restitution to their heirs. So back then, £600 would have been quite a lot of money, but still it does not excuse the actions that took place.
No, I mean, I can't even fathom how much that would be in these days. But I mean, at least there was some sort of compensation.
Yeah, no, definitely. And moving on to 1752, the Salem village is renamed Danvers to remove any tie to the historical name and the unfortunate events that took place while trying to rebirth a new time for the village.
I didn't know that, I didn't know that.
Nor did I.
Salem Village was no longer a thing anymore.
Nor did I, absolutely. And now moving on over 200 years, in 1957, Massachusetts formally apologised for the events of 1692. And then the final date in the timeline, in 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, a witchcraft memorial designed by James Cutler is dedicated in Salem. And that brings us to the end of our 3rd episode.
Wow. I mean, that was, so much information, so many names, but I think it was important for you to say their names because of what they went through.
Exactly. No, it is paying respect and it's paying tribute to the people that have experienced circumstances that we couldn't even fathom or begin to comprehend. So
yeah,
it was definitely, I needed to say their names. Yeah. And I hope it was easy to follow and I hope it made sense. But But yeah, that is the conclusion of the third podcast regarding witches and the history of the Salem trials.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was very insightful. And for all of you history buffs that are looking forward to our next instalment, I will be looking into the life of Henry VIII, a former king of England in the Tudor period. Now, the Tudor period is one of my favourite periods of English history, so hopefully you'll tune in over the weekend to listen to our fourth episode. Now, in the meantime, if you have any comments or suggestions, or you want us to look at anything in particular, then please do email us at uncoveringhistorypodcast@gmail.com. So that's it from us for today.
It is indeed.
Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you in the near future.
Yeah, thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.